The Ghosts of Whitby Abbey, a story from North Yorkshire. Autumn 1983. Whitby, North Yorkshire, England. When Claire moved to the North Yorkshire coast, she knew she was stepping into history. Whitby, with its narrow streets, ancient buildings, and mist-laden cliffs, seemed a place out of time, a town woven from the remnants of myths and long-buried stories. The Gothic ruins of Whitby Abbey loomed over the town from their cliffside perch, dominating the skyline, a stark reminder of centuries past. The Abbey had called to her, as if it had been waiting for her to arrive. She'd always been drawn to places with histories, and Whitby was full of them. She rented a small flat near the harbour, within view of the Abbey ruins. She could see them from her window, their darkened arches silhouetted against the sky, and often found herself staring up at the cliffs, imagining the lives that had once thrived there. But she soon learned that Whitby's history was more than stones and stories. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the Abbey, warning against wandering its grounds after dark. The most enduring legend was that of Constance, a young woman who had been once a nun within the Abbey's walls. Constance's story was one of sorrow, betrayal, and death, and her spirit was said to haunt the Abbey still, mourning what she had lost. Though Claire had never been one for ghost stories, she couldn't resist the pull of the Abbey. She spent hours wandering the ruins by day, studying the intricate stonework and the towering arches that seemed to scrape the sky. She'd bring her sketchbook, finding inspiration in the eerie beauty of the crumbling monastery. Yet she always left before nightfall, heeding the villagers' warnings. One crisp autumn evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the ruins in an orange glow, Claire decided to stay a little longer, wanting to capture the fading light in her sketches. As the shadows lengthened, an unnatural silence fell over the Abbey, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. She became aware of a chill creeping into the air, more biting than the autumn wind. Her heart began to race, though she wasn't sure why. She had the distinct feeling of being watched, of someone or something standing just beyond her sight. She scanned the ruins, her eyes darting to every dark corner, every crevice, but saw nothing. It was then that she heard the footsteps. Soft and shuffling, they echoed through the empty abbey, the sound bouncing off the ancient walls. Claire froze, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, approaching from somewhere within the maze of ruined corridors. A voice, barely more than a whisper, seemed to drift through the air. She couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency, a desperation to the tone. Claire's pulse quickened. She closed her sketchbook and turned to leave, but something held her back. It was as if an invisible hand were pressing down on her shoulder, rooting her to the spot. She took a shaky breath, feeling her heartbeat pound in her ears, and called out, "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy. She glanced around, feeling a flicker of fear that she couldn't quite shake, and then in the fading light she saw her. A figure, barely discernible in the dim twilight, stood at the edge of one of the broken archways. She wore a simple gown that seemed to blend with the shadows, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly raised her head, revealing a pale, sorrowful face, her eyes dark with an unspeakable sadness. It was Constance. Claire knew it as surely as if the woman had spoken her name. The ghost's presence was almost tangible, filling the air with a sorrow that seeped into Claire's bones. She wanted to look away, to turn and run, but she was transfixed, caught in the spirit's mournful gaze. The woman's lips parted, and though her voice was barely more than a whisper, Claire heard her words as clearly as she had spoken them aloud. "Help me." The plea cut through Claire, filling her with an overwhelming sorrow. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the figure began to move, gliding through the archway and disappearing into the shadows beyond. Without thinking, Claire followed, her footsteps echoing as she moved deeper into the ruins. She wasn't sure what compelled her, just only that she had to know, had to understand what the spirit was trying to tell her. She wound through the maze of crumbling walls, the shadows thickening around her as the last traces of daylight vanished. At last, she found herself in a small darkened chamber. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. She turned, searching for any sign of the ghostly figure, when a cold, bony hand brushed against her shoulder. Claire spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing inches away, was Constance, her face drawn with grief, her eyes hollow and dark. Claire found her voice. "What happened to you?" The ghost's gaze softened, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask that question for centuries. Slowly, she began to speak, her voice a faint whisper that seemed to carry the weight of ages. "I was betrayed." Constance's voice trembled. "I was promised to the Abbey, but I fell in love. I was young, foolish, and he was a nobleman, promised to another. When he found out I was with child, he cast me aside. And the Abbey?" Her voice broke, her gaze dropping as she relived the pain. "They said I had sinned, that I was to be punished. They walled me up, here, alive." Claire's eyes widened as the truth sank in. She looked at the walls, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. The villagers' tales were true. Constance had been entombed alive, left to die in darkness, condemned for a love that had betrayed her. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and Claire felt a suffocating pressure, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She backed away, her heart racing, but Constance reached out, her ghostly hand passing through Claire's own. "Free me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell them. Tell my story." The darkness grew, and for a moment Claire could barely breathe. The sensation of the walls pressing down on her, the weight of centuries of suffering almost unbearable. She staggered back, feeling her way toward the exit, her hand brushing against the cold stone. When she looked up, Constance was gone. Claire fled the Abbey, her footsteps echoing through the silence. She didn't stop running until she reached her cottage, slamming the door behind her and collapsing against it, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. In the days that followed, Claire couldn't shake the memory of Constance's face, her sorrowful eyes, the desperation in her voice. She began to research the history of the Abbey, searching for any record of the tragedy she had witnessed. Her search led her to the old parish records, where she found a single faded entry that confirmed her experience. A nun named Constance, accused of sins of the flesh and sentenced to the eternal silence within the Abbey's walls. Haunted by Constance's story, Claire became determined to make the truth known. She wrote articles, gave interviews, speaking about the legend of the Abbey and the tragic fate of the young woman who had loved and lost so deeply. Locals began to leave offerings at the Abbey's ruins, small tokens of remembrance for a life lost to history. Years later, as Claire stood at the cliffs, looking up at the Abbey's ruins, she felt a strange peace. She sensed that Constance was finally at rest, her story no longer hidden, her voice no longer silenced. But some still say that, on quiet autumn nights, if you listen closely near the Abbey walls, you can hear a whisper carried on in the wind, a faint, mournful plea that echoes through the ruins, a reminder of a love lost and a soul freed. "Help me,